My son's fiancée saw my muddy boots, pressed a silk scarf to her nose, and snapped that they should send me to sleep in the stable. She told the security guards not to let me ruin her imported rugs. The room went dead silent. My son set down his glass, looked at her, and asked if she knew who I was, in that moment standing in my worn flannel shirt. I thought my son was finally standing up for his old man. I thought he loved me. But I was wrong. The greatest pain a man can endure does not come from his enemies. It comes from his own flesh and blood, wearing a smile while holding a knife to his back. I am William. And before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Texas meant hard work to outsiders, but inside our sprawling estate, a different kind of coldness was taking root. It had been a blistering afternoon. The Texas sun was merciless, beating down on the cracked earth of the south pasture. I had spent 10 agonizing hours on a tractor covered in grease and sweat, fixing a busted irrigation pipe that threatened to ruin an entire sector of our crops. At 72 years old, my bones ached with a deep, persistent throb, but I had never been the kind of man to sit behind a mahogany desk while there was real work to be done. I built Harrison AgriCorp from a single dusty acre into a multi-hundred-million-dollar empire using these very hands. My late wife Catherine and I poured our youth, our sweat, and our souls into this land. I wore my faded flannel shirts and my scuffed leather boots like badges of honor. They were reminders of who I was and where I came from. But to the new generation, to my son Lucas and his soon-to-be wife Victoria, my boots were nothing more than an embarrassment. I parked the old farm truck near the back entrance of the main house, wiping the grease from my forehead with a rag. I had completely forgotten about the lavish engagement party Lucas was hosting that evening. The mansion was ablaze with crystal chandeliers and filled with the scent of expensive catered food and heavy perfumes. Politicians, corporate executives, and socialites mingled in the grand foyer. I stepped through the heavy oak doors, just wanting to quietly make my way to the back stairs and take a hot shower. But luck was not on my side. As I walked into the hallway, leaving a faint trail of dried mud on the pristine marble floor, Victoria turned around. She was wearing a designer gown that probably cost more than a new tractor. When her eyes landed on me, her face contorted into a mask of pure disgust. She pulled a silk scarf from her clutch, pressed it against her nose as if I were a decaying animal, and raised her chin. Her voice pierced through the soft jazz music playing in the background. She ordered the security guards to get me out of her sight. She told them to send me to sleep in the stable where I belonged, complaining loudly that my filth was ruining her expensive rugs. The music seemed to stop. Dozens of wealthy guests turned to stare at me. Whispers rippled through this crowd. I stood there clutching my dirt-stained cap, feeling a strange mixture of shame and anger. I was the founder of this entire estate. Every brick, every rug, every drop of wine in their glasses was paid for by the sweat of the man she was calling filthy. Before I could say a word, Lucas stepped out from the crowd. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, looking every bit the successful CEO I had groomed him to be. He firmly grabbed Victoria by the arm. His face was stern. He looked around the silent room, then looked directly at his fiancée and asked her if she knew who I was. He told her in a loud, commanding voice that I was William Harrison, his father, and the creator of everything she was enjoying. He demanded that she apologize to me immediately. Victoria turned pale. She stammered a quiet apology, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. Lucas then walked over to him, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, and told the guests to carry on. He guided me to the stairs, whispering that he was so sorry, and that the wedding stress was getting to her head. As I walked up to my room, my heart swelled with a foolish, desperate pride. I thought I had done a good job. I thought that despite the money and the corporate greed that surrounded him, my son still possessed a core of honor and love for his father. I took a warm shower, ate a simple sandwich in my room, and went to bed feeling at peace. I believed my legacy was in safe hands. but the illusion shattered at 2 in the morning. I woke up feeling parched. My throat was dry from breathing in dust all day, so I put on my robe and walked quietly down the back stairs toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. The house was completely dark and silent, the guests having left hours ago. As I approached the kitchen, I heard the sound of running water. I paused in the hallway, hiding in the shadows. Lucas was standing at the kitchen sink. He had his sleeves rolled up and was scrubbing his hands together furiously, almost violently, under the freezing tap water. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He was breathing heavily, talking to himself in a frantic, manic whisper. I held my breath and listened. I was muttering over and over again, saying that he just needed 3 more days. He told himself to just keep the old fool happy for 3 more days. He whispered that if Victoria ruined the plan before Friday, they were both going to be dead. My blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, chilling me to my core. Keep the old fool happy. 3 more days. Plan. Dead. What plan? What was happening on Friday? The pride I had felt just hours earlier evaporated, replaced by a sickening dread. I quietly backed away, stepping carefully, so the wooden floorboards would not creak. I returned to my room, locked the door, and sat on the edge of my mattress, staring at the dark mahogany floorboards as the chilling words echoed in my mind over and over again. Just 3 more days. Just keep the old fool happy for 3 more days. My own son, the boy I had raised, had spoken those words with a venom that made my stomach churn. I did not sleep for the rest of the night, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. When the morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long golden streams across the room, I realized that his public defense of me was not born out of love. It was a calculated performance to protect his investment. I knew I had to play the hardest role of my life. I had to be the clueless father they needed me to be. At exactly 8 o'clock, a soft, rhythmic knock echoed against my heavy oak bedroom door. Before I could even tell him to enter, the brass handle turned slowly, and Lucas walked right in. He was dressed in a crisp, dark blue tailored suit, looking every bit the polished, wealthy chief executive officer of Harrison Agricorp. In his hands, he carried a polished silver tray, holding a plate of warm, freshly baked pastries and a large porcelain mug. The rich, bold aroma of premium dark roast coffee immediately filled the entire room, cutting through the morning chill. It was not just any coffee. It was brewed exactly the way my late wife Catherine used to prepare it for me on peaceful Sunday mornings, with a small dash of sweet cinnamon and a single sugar cube. It was a highly deliberate, deeply manipulative, and thoroughly calculated gesture designed entirely to disarm my emotions and completely lower my natural defenses before his next move. Lucas set the tray down on the small table near the window with a bright, charming smile. He pulled up a chair sitting across from me and let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, shaking his head as if burdened by immense guilt. "Dad." He began, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. "I wanted to come up here and personally apologize for Victoria's behavior last night. She was completely out of line. I told her how deeply she disrespected you, and she is incredibly embarrassed by her outburst." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees to appear vulnerable. "You have to understand, Dad, she is just a city girl. She grew up in a completely different world, surrounded by concrete and high society. She does not understand our farm culture or the pride we take in our hard work. On top of that, the immense pressure of planning this massive wedding is giving her severe anxiety. She is overwhelmed, but she truly respects you. She knows you built this entire empire from the dirt up." I picked up the porcelain mug and took a slow, measured sip of the hot coffee. The taste of cinnamon brought a sharp pang of grief for Catherine to my chest, but I pushed it down. I forced a warm, understanding smile onto my face, mirroring his false sincerity. I waved my hand dismissively and told him not to worry about it at all. I said that wedding planning makes everyone crazy and that tempers always run high before the big day. I assured him that I held no grudges against his future bride, and that we were all family here. Lucas visibly relaxed his broad shoulders, dropping in apparent relief. He let out a soft chuckle, thanking me for being so understanding. He had bought my performance completely. He genuinely believed that his old father was still the naive, forgiving man he had always known. Then, with the smooth, calculated precision of a seasoned predator, he pivoted to his real objective. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a sleek black leather briefcase onto the table. The metallic latches popped open with a sharp, sterile sound. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents, sliding them across the smooth wooden surface toward me. The paper felt thick and expensive. "Oh, before I forget," he said casually, as if it were a minor afterthought. The new corporate lawyer Matthew finally drew up those routine tax restructuring papers we discussed last month. You know how the state of Texas just passed those aggressive new agricultural tax laws. If we do not update our corporate holding structure immediately, the government is going to hit AgriCorp with millions of dollars in unnecessary penalty fees. We need to protect the family assets, Dad. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He laid it gently on top of the documents. He pointed to a series of bright yellow sticky notes, marking at least a dozen different signature lines across the dense pages. "We just need your authorization to finalize the transfer of the holding entities. It is all standard legal boilerplate, but Matthew said we absolutely must file these with the state treasury by Friday to beat the quarterly deadline." Friday. The exact day he had furiously whispered about in the dark kitchen just hours ago, the deadline that would supposedly keep them from being dead. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs, a loud, frantic rhythm that I feared he might actually hear. My palms grew damp, but I forced my hands to remain steady. I looked down at the documents. The legal jargon was dense, filled with complex clauses, tiny print, and convoluted financial terminology. I knew I needed to read every single word on those pages, but I could not possibly do it with him sitting right there watching my every move with the predatory focus of a hawk. I patted the front pocket of my flannel shirt, then patted my pants pockets, frowning, as if I were confused. I let out a frustrated sigh and told him that I must have left my reading glasses on my nightstand, or perhaps in the bathroom. Lucas's charming smile tightened just a fraction of an inch, the muscles in his jaw ticking slightly. He eagerly offered to go look for them, half rising from his chair. He was desperate for me to sign the papers right then and there. I shook my head and suddenly faked a harsh, rattling coughing fit. I brought a napkin to my mouth, wheezing loudly, hunching my shoulders to appear frail and exhausted. I told him I was feeling quite under the weather from breathing in so much dust out in the pastures yesterday. I waved him off, saying I just needed to lie down and rest my old bones for a little while. I promised him I would find my glasses, review the tax papers thoroughly, and sign every single page for him tonight. For a microsecond, the charming mask slipped completely. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage crossed Lucas's face. His eyes darkened with absolute fury, but just as quickly, the mask snapped back into place. He forced a smile, leaving the pen behind, and walked out the door. I sat alone for a long time, staring at the empty doorway where my son had just stood. The heavy, polished wood of the door seemed to mock me, a symbol of the wealth that was now poisoning my own bloodline. The silence in the bedroom felt heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. I knew those were not routine tax documents. I did not know exactly what they were yet, but my gut feeling, honed by decades of survival in the ruthless world of commercial agriculture, told me they were extremely dangerous. I needed to clear my aching head and figure out my next move. I gathered the thick stack of premium paper, placed it inside my heavy iron floor safe, and locked it tight. I grabbed my worn leather boots, slipped them onto my feet, and walked out of the sprawling mansion. The morning air was already growing intensely hot. The unforgiving Texas sun beat down on my shoulders as I made my way toward the towering silver grain silos in the distance. I walked along the familiar dirt paths that Catherine and I had carved out together, So many years ago, every single acre of this vast land held a profound memory. I remembered the devastating droughts we had miraculously survived, the bitterly harsh winters that tested our resolve, and the terrifying times we almost went entirely bankrupt, but held on through sheer stubborn willpower. We built this massive legacy so our family would never have to struggle for anything. Now, that very same legacy was tearing my family apart from the inside out. I needed someone I could absolutely trust. I headed straight toward the foreman's office. I needed to talk to Hank. Hank was far more than just a hired farm employee. He was my oldest and most trusted friend in the entire world. We had worked side by side in the dirt and mud for over 30 years. Back in the scorching summer of 1990, a group of armed, desperate thieves had tried to violently hijack our main equipment trucks during a late-night transport. Hank did not hesitate or run for cover. He leaped forward and took a heavy-caliber bullet straight to the shoulder while physically pushing me out of the direct line of fire. He bled on this soil just like I did. We spent countless nights sitting by the fire, drinking cheap coffee and planning the future of this very farm. We were brothers bound by blood loyalty and a lifetime of shared hardships. If anyone on this entire estate knew what was really happening in the shadowy corners of my company, it would be him. I needed his steady voice and his unwavering honesty right now more than ever before. But as I finally reached the small, familiar wooden office building situated near the main tractor sheds, everything felt incredibly wrong. The familiar hum of activity was entirely absent. The heavy wooden door was firmly locked from the outside. Looking through the dusty glass window, my heart sank. Hank's usually cluttered desk was completely cleared off. The framed photographs of his smiling grandchildren were gone. His lucky ceramic coffee mug, the one he drank from every single morning for 20 years, was nowhere to be seen. The entire room had been stripped bare, scrubbed clean of any trace that my oldest friend had ever existed within those walls. Before I could even begin to fully process this disturbing sight, two massive men stepped out from behind a parked green harvester. They wore crisp, tightly fitted black suits and dark sunglasses. They did not look like farmhands or local ranch security. They looked like expensive, highly trained private mercenaries, hired to intimidate and control. They moved with a synchronized, threatening grace, completely blocking my path to the office door. Their faces were entirely void of any human expression or warmth. The taller of the two men stepped forward, crossing his thick arms over his broad chest. He told me in a flat, mechanical voice that this specific area was now restricted to authorized corporate personnel only. I narrowed my eyes, feeling a sudden surge of hot, defiant anger bubbling up in my throat. I stood my ground, looked the man in the eyes, and told him I owned every blade of grass on this entire property. I demanded to know exactly where Hank was and why his office looked like a ghost town. The guard stared down at me with cold, detached indifference. He stated mechanically that Lucas had officially terminated Hank's employment late last week. He claimed that the internal company auditors had supposedly caught Hank embezzling thousands of gallons of premium tractor fuel and secretly selling it on the local black market. I felt a dizzying, nauseating wave of disbelief wash over me. The accusation was so profoundly ridiculous, it felt like a physical slap to the face. Hank was a man of impeccable, unshakable integrity. I was the kind of man who would walk 5 miles in the pouring rain just to return a dropped penny to a stranger. The very idea of him stealing company fuel to make a quick buck was beyond absurd. It was an outright maliciously crafted fabrication designed to ruin a good man. I knew instantly that my son had orchestrated this vicious lie to remove the only person on the farm who would ever dare to question his authority or protect my interests. I did not waste my breath arguing with the stone-faced guards. There was no point fighting foot soldiers who were simply following poisonous orders. I turned slowly and walked away, my boots kicking up small clouds of dry dust with every heavy step. My hands were trembling, not from the creeping frailty of old age, but from a boiling righteous fury. I reached into the front pocket of my faded jeans and pulled out my old battered flip phone. My fingers fumbled slightly over the worn plastic buttons as I quickly dialed Hank's personal cell phone number. I held the small speaker tight against my ear, desperately praying he would pick up the line and explain the nightmare that was unfolding around me. I waited for the familiar ringtone. Instead, a cold, automated operator voice echoed sharply in my ear, stating clearly that the number I had dialed was disconnected or no longer in service. A cold, damp sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My loyal foreman was gone, erased without a single trace. I was completely surrounded by strange, threatening guards on the very land I had cultivated with my own hands. My son was desperately trying to force my signature on mysterious, incredibly dangerous documents before a sudden Friday deadline. I felt an overwhelming, suffocating sense of isolation tightening around my chest. I stopped right in the middle of the wide gravel courtyard and looked slowly back up toward the towering main mansion. Standing perfectly still on the second-floor stone balcony was Victoria. She was sipping casually from a tall crystal glass, looking down at me, just like a queen surveying a conquered peasant. When she saw me looking up, she did not flinch or look away. Instead, a slow, highly predatory smirk spread across her flawless face. She raised her glass in a mocking, silent toast to my sudden realization. In that exact terrifying moment, the final lingering shred of my paternal denial vanished entirely into the hot wind. I was not a happy father joyfully preparing for his only son's upcoming wedding. I was a marked target standing completely exposed in the middle of an active minefield. The brutal, silent war for control over Harrison Agricorp had already begun, and I was the only person who did not know I was under attack. But they had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. They forgot who they were dealing with. I did not return to the main house. I walked straight to my old pickup truck, the one with the rusted bumper and the engine that rattled like a coffee can full of bolts. I climbed into the cab, tossed the heavy stack of documents onto the passenger seat, and drove toward the corporate headquarters of Harrison Agricorp. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. I used every single one of those minutes to mentally prepare myself for the performance I was about to give. I needed to be the doddering, easily confused old farmer that my son expected. I parked the truck in the visitor lot, completely ignoring the reserved spaces, and walked into the massive glass and steel building I had funded with my own two hands. The lobby was a monument to corporate vanity. Sleek marble floors, abstract steel sculptures, and a reception desk that looked like a spaceship. The young woman behind the desk did not recognize me at first. I was just an old man in a faded flannel shirt and dusty boots. When I told her my name, her eyes went wide, and she immediately rushed to escort me to the executive elevators. I pressed the button for the top floor. That was where Lucas had established his new executive suite, and where he had placed his hand-picked corporate attorney, Matthew Caldwell. Matthew was a young, sharp-suited shark from Chicago. Lucas had brought him in 6 months ago, claiming we needed aggressive legal representation to handle our rapid expansion. I had never liked the man. He wore too much expensive cologne, smiled with far too many teeth, and always seemed to be secretly calculating the exact financial worth of every single person who walked into the massive corporate conference room area. I stepped out of the elevator and walked down the quiet, heavily carpeted hallway. The air conditioning was turned up so high it felt like a meat locker. I found Matthew's corner office. The heavy glass door was partially open. I pushed it the rest of the way and stepped inside. Matthew was sitting behind a massive glass desk, frantically typing on a silver laptop. He wore a crisp gray suit and a bright red silk tie. When he looked up and saw me standing there, a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic crossed his completely shaved, pale face now. He quickly slammed the laptop shut, stood up and forced a wide, plastic smile. He walked around the desk, extending his hand, greeting me enthusiastically. I shook his hand weakly, letting my shoulders slump forward. I pitched my voice a little higher, making it sound frail and unsure. I told him I was incredibly sorry to bother him, but Lucas had given me some highly complicated tax papers this morning, and my tired old eyes just could not make any sense of all the fancy legal words written in the tiny print across the numerous, very thick white pages. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick stack of documents, laying them clumsily on his pristine glass desk. Matthew's eyes instantly darted to the papers, and I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. He told me there was absolutely no need for me to worry about reading the fine print deeply, assuring me it was all just standard government bureaucracy. He picked up a sleek silver pen from his desk organizer and aggressively pushed it toward me, sliding the documents closer to my own chest. He said if I just signed on the yellow tags, he would personally ensure everything was filed correctly, and the company would be completely safe from the new state tax hikes. I did not take the pen. Instead, I picked up the first page and held it close to my face, squinting hard. I slowly ran my thick, calloused finger down the edge of the stiff paper. I asked him in a slow, highly confused tone why a standard agricultural tax form required the physical presence of an independent medical witness to clearly verify my current state of mind. The temperature in the executive room was freezing, but a large bead of sweat suddenly formed on Matthew's forehead. It rolled down his temple, tracing a shiny, wet path across his pale skin. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, actively avoiding my eyes entirely. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at the heavy wooden door standing behind me. He stammered loudly, his smooth corporate voice cracking under the intense pressure. He claimed it was just a new, overly cautious state regulation, specifically designed for primary corporate shareholders over the age of 70 years old. He frantically insisted it was just a boring formality and absolutely nothing to be overly concerned about. I slowly turned to the third page, continuing to pretend to struggle significantly with the reading. I pointed directly to a specific paragraph buried deep within the complex text. I asked him, keeping my voice perfectly innocent and steady, why this specific tax form gave my son the unconditional legal authority to completely transfer my personal banking assets into an obscure offshore holding company without my direct written consent. Matthew stopped breathing. The color completely drained from his terrified-looking face now, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost. He reached out blindly to lean on his thick glass desk for physical support. In his absolute uncontrollable panic, his trembling right hand knocked violently into his full ceramic coffee cup. The heavy mug tipped over instantly, sending a dark, boiling hot pool of black coffee spilling rapidly across the pristine glass desk, soaking directly into the crisp white edges of the vital legal documents. Matthew let out a strangled, desperate gasp. He lunged forward aggressively and frantically snatched the soaking wet papers completely away from my two reaching hands. He clutched the damaged papers tightly to his chest, as if his very life depended on their safety. His chest heaved dramatically as he breathed in shallow, ragged, and terrified gasps. He grabbed a massive handful of brown paper towels and wiped frantically at the wet desk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the paper steady. He looked at me with wide, completely terrified eyes. He told me the crucial documents were entirely ruined and that he would absolutely have to print a completely new batch for me to sign properly at a much later time. Then he leaned in incredibly close to me, his voice dropping rapidly to a desperate, fearful whisper. He begged me not to tell Lucas about our secret conversation or the spilled coffee. I nodded my head slowly, flawlessly, playing the completely bewildered old man, and turned around. I walked purposefully out of the freezing corporate office. As I pulled the heavy glass door securely shut behind me, I glanced directly to my left. Standing perfectly still in the shadowed alcove outside the office was a heavily armed bodyguard. He was not protecting Matthew. He was keeping him an absolute prisoner. I drove back to the sprawling estate, with my hands gripping the worn steering wheel of my old pickup truck so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The blistering heat of the Texas afternoon radiated through the windshield, but my blood felt like ice. Matthew Caldwell was a corporate hostage. My lifelong foreman, Hank, had been erased without a trace, and my own son was orchestrating a legal maneuver designed to strip me of my wealth and my freedom. The sheer scale of the betrayal was suffocating. I pulled the truck into the long, circular driveway leading up to the main mansion. The massive stone house, a structure Catherine and I had designed together, brick by brick, loomed ahead of me against the bright blue sky. It used to be a sanctuary, a place filled with the warm smells of home cooking and the loud, joyful echoes of family gatherings. Now it felt like an enormous, silent tomb waiting to swallow me whole. I parked the truck and walked slowly through the heavy front doors. The grand foyer was eerily quiet. The domestic staff had apparently been dismissed for the afternoon, leaving the house completely empty. I made my way toward the grand, sweeping staircase, intending to return to my bedroom and securely lock away the horrifying documents. As I reached the second-floor landing, a sharp, violent sound shattered the heavy silence of the house. It was the unmistakable, brittle crash of breaking glass. The noise echoed down from the ceiling above me, coming directly from the third-floor attic space. The attic was a sacred place in this house. It was the designated room where Catherine had carefully stored decades of our family history. Photo albums, antique furniture, and precious mementos from our early years of struggling on the farm were all meticulously preserved up there. My heart skipped a beat, and a fresh wave of dread washed over me. I abandoned my path to the bedroom and quickly climbed the narrow, creaking wooden stairs leading up to the attic. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The hot, stale air of the confined space immediately hit my face, carrying the familiar scent of old paper and cedar wood. Dust motes danced lazily in the beams of sunlight filtering through the small, circular window. Standing right in the middle of the room, surrounded by piles of discarded boxes, was Victoria. She was wearing a pristine white silk blouse and sharp designer slacks, looking entirely out of place in the dusty storage area. At her feet were 3 heavy-duty black plastic contractor garbage bags. I froze in the doorway, in absolute horror at what she was doing. She was holding a beautiful, ornate silver picture frame in her manicured hands. Inside the frame was a cherished photograph of Catherine and me from our 20th wedding anniversary. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Victoria tossed the heavy silver frame callously into one of the black garbage bags. It landed with a dull, sickening thud against other discarded items. I took a heavy step into the room, my boots thudding loudly against the bare wooden floorboards. Victoria jumped, letting out a sharp gasp of surprise. She spun around, her eyes widening as she saw me standing there. Before she could speak, I looked down at the floor surrounding her expensive designer heels. Scattered across the aged wood were the shattered, jagged remains of at least a dozen glass picture frames. The beautiful, smiling faces of my late wife, my young son, and my old friends were torn, crumpled, and dusted with thousands of tiny, glittering shards of broken glass. I felt a physical pain in my chest, a deep, agonizing ache that stole the breath straight from my lungs. These were not just photographs. They were the tangible proof of Catherine's beautiful existence. They were the very foundation of this family. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" I asked. My voice came out as a low, dangerous, gravelly whisper, barely concealing the immense sorrow and rising fury churning inside my chest. Victoria's face instantly morphed into a flawless mask of flustered innocence. She pressed a delicate hand against her chest, feigning a look of profound shock and deep apology. "Oh, William, you startled me so badly," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I am so incredibly sorry about this awful mess. Lucas and I were just talking this morning about how cluttered the house has become. We are expecting dozens of massive, expensive wedding gifts from my family and our high society friends in the coming days. We simply have absolutely nowhere to put them all. I thought I would be helpful and come up here to clear out some of this dusty old junk to make proper space for our new things." She gestured carelessly toward the shattered glass littering the floor around her feet. I was trying to carry a heavy box of these old pictures to the corner, and it just slipped right out of my hands. The bottom of the cardboard broke open, and they all fell. It was a complete terrible accident. I feel just awful about it, I truly do. I stared down at the floor. The heavy silver and solid oak frames had not merely fallen from a broken box. The thick glass covering the delicate photographs was not just cracked from a simple drop. The glass was entirely pulverized down deeply into the grain of the wooden floorboards. The edges of the wooden frames were splintered and crushed. I looked up from the floor and let my eyes travel slowly down to Victoria's feet. She was wearing sharp, pointed designer boots with a heavy, solid heel. The heel of her right boot was covered in a fine layer of crushed, glittering glass dust. She had not dropped the box. She had systematically thrown the photographs onto the floor and violently stomped them into oblivion. She was actively, maliciously destroying the memory of the woman who had built the very house she was currently standing in. I slowly knelt down, my old knees popping in the quiet room. I ignored the sharp shards of glass pressing into my skin as I carefully reached out and picked up a torn, crumpled photograph. It was a picture of Catherine holding a newborn, Lucas in the hospital, her tired face radiating an absolute pure and unconditional love for the boy who would one day try to destroy us both. I brushed a piece of broken glass off Catherine's smiling face with my thumb. Victoria stood above me, shifting uncomfortably, letting out a soft, impatient sigh. She clearly viewed my grief as a pathetic, annoying inconvenience to her afternoon chore of erasing my past. I stood back up, clutching the torn photograph tightly against my chest. I looked Victoria directly in the eyes. I did not yell. I did not accuse her of lying. I simply nodded my head slowly, letting the mask of the weak, confused old man slip back perfectly into place. I told her to please be very careful not to cut her hands on the sharp glass, and I turned around, walking quietly out of the stifling attic. I made my way down the stairs, every step feeling like a march toward an inevitable execution. As I reached the safety of my locked bedroom, the memory of Catherine's final days in the hospital came rushing back to me with a vivid, painful clarity. The room had smelled strongly of sterile antiseptic and fading hope. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor had been the only sound. Catherine had looked so frail, her skin pale and paper-thin against the white hospital sheets, but her eyes had been sharp, clear, and filled with a terrifying, prophetic wisdom. She had reached out, with a trembling hand, gripping my fingers with a surprising, desperate strength. She had pulled me close, her warm breath ghosting across my ear. She had whispered, her voice weak but incredibly urgent. You can love our son with all of your heart. You can give him the world. But never ever hand him the weapon he needs to destroy you. He has too much ambition and far too little soul. I stood in the center of my bedroom, looking down at the shredded glass-covered photograph of my beautiful wife. The truth settled over me like a suffocating, heavy winter blanket. This was no longer just a simple case of a greedy son trying to trick his father out of a few $1,000,000 or a piece of valuable land. This was a hostile, calculated, and entirely ruthless takeover of my very existence. They were systematically dismantling my support system. They were terrorizing my loyal friends. They were mocking my legacy and stomping the sacred memory of my dead wife into the floorboards. My own home, the sanctuary I had built with my own blood and sweat, had transformed into a silent, deadly war zone. And as I stared at the torn image of the son I had raised, I finally realized with absolute horrifying certainty that I was the primary target. I waited in my locked bedroom until the grandfather clock downstairs chimed midnight. The sprawling mansion was quiet, swallowed by the thick darkness of the Texas night. I knew I could not take my usual truck. Lucas had likely installed digital trackers on all the primary vehicles. I quietly slipped out through the side door of the kitchen and made my way directly to the oldest barn on the very edge of the property. Sitting under a heavy canvas tarp was a rusted 1982 Chevrolet pickup. It had not been driven in months, but I knew the engine. I eased the creaking door open, slid into the torn leather seat, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life with a familiar rumble. I kept the headlights off until I was well past the main gates, navigating by the pale moonlight, reflecting off the dusty gravel road. My mind raced with the image of Catherine's destroyed photographs. My own home was no longer safe. I had to find Hank. I had to know the absolute truth. The drive to the very edge of the county took nearly an hour. I drove past the wealthy subdivisions and massive corporate farms, heading deep into a forgotten pocket of the valley. The paved road gave way to cracked asphalt and then to loose dirt. I pulled into the desolate, overgrown grounds of the trailer park. It was a bleak, forgotten place. Flickering amber streetlights cast long shadows across the rusted metal roofs of the dilapidated mobile homes. Feral dogs barked in the distance, their voices carrying over the hum of broken air conditioning units. It broke my heart to know that Hank, who had dedicated 30 long years of his life to building my family empire, had been reduced to living in a desperate place like this. I slowly drove the old Chevrolet down the narrow, pothole-ridden lanes until I spotted his familiar silver sedan parked unevenly on a patch of dead grass. It sat in front of a faded, dented trailer at the very back of the lot. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my heavy boots. I walked up the unstable wooden steps of the trailer and knocked firmly on the thin aluminum door. There was no immediate answer. I knocked again, calling out his name in a low whisper. I heard the distinct sound of a deadbolt sliding back, followed by the turning of a metal chain lock. The door cracked open just an inch. A pair of terrified, bloodshot eyes peered out at me from the darkness. As soon as he recognized my face, the heavy chain dropped. A hand darted out, grabbing my flannel shirt. He pulled me inside with desperate strength and slammed the door shut, immediately locking all 3 deadbolts in rapid succession. The air inside the small trailer was stifling and smelled strongly of rubbing alcohol and stale sweat. The only light came from a single bare yellow bulb hanging above the tiny kitchen counter. I turned to look at my oldest friend, and the breath completely left my lungs. Hank was an absolute wreck. The left side of his face was a swollen, terrifying canvas of dark purple and deep black bruises. His lower lip was split and scabbed over. A thick white medical bandage was taped awkwardly over his right eyebrow. He stood hunched over, favoring his ribs, breathing in shallow, painful gasps. He looked like a man who had survived a horrific car crash, but I knew better. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but he flinched, stepping back into the shadows of the narrow hallway. He was trembling violently, his weathered hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the cheap laminate counter. He asked me what I was doing there, his voice cracking with pure terror. He warned me that I had to leave immediately, looking frantically out the small kitchen window as if expecting those massive men in black suits to kick down the door at any second. He told me that if Lucas found out I was visiting him, those mercenaries would come back. I kept my voice incredibly calm and steady, trying to anchor him to reality. I told him I was not going anywhere until he told me exactly what had happened. I mentioned the stolen tractor fuel, the excuse Lucas and his private guards had fed me. Hank let out a bitter laugh that ended in a sharp cough. He wiped a drop of saliva from his split lip and looked at me with deep sadness. He swore on his life that he had never stolen a single drop of fuel from my farm. He told me the theft accusation was nothing more than a convenient fabricated lie to discredit him and throw me completely off the trail. The real reason he was beaten and discarded like trash was because he had simply done his job too well. As the senior foreman, Hank had routine access to the primary operational expenditure logs for the heavy machinery division. He explained that 3 weeks ago he had noticed massive, unexplainable discrepancies in the quarterly budget reports. The numbers were wrong. He hobbled to a wooden table, pulled out a hidden folder, and spread crumpled spreadsheets across the surface. He pointed a trembling finger at the highlighted columns. He told me Harrison Agricorp was bleeding cash at a terrifying rate. Multi-million-dollar hemorrhages were being completely masked as routine agricultural equipment purchases and seasonal investments. The money was never going to our regular domestic vendors. Hank had quietly tracked the routing numbers on his own time. He discovered millions were being systematically funneled, completely out of the company, and directly into a complex web of obscure offshore shell companies located in countries without extradition treaties. He had taken his findings directly to Lucas, thinking my son was simply the victim of a clever external corporate scam. Instead of thanking him, Lucas had locked the office door, called in his new security team, and let them beat Hank half to death, while he watched with a completely blank expression. Lucas told him to stay silent. He hobbled painfully, slowly, to the dirty, rusted sink, spat blood into the drain. I stared down at the financial papers, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washing over me like a freezing tidal wave. My son was not a greedy heir. I was actively destroying the very foundation of my life's work, ripping apart everything Catherine and I built together. I looked back up at Hank. His badly bruised face was pale, his eyes wide with a desperate, haunting urgency, silently pleading for me to believe him. He reached out and grabbed the collar of my flannel shirt, his knuckles turning white as he pulled me close. He was trembling so hard his teeth chattered. "Will whatever Lucas asks you to sign, do not do it, my friend. He isn't buying any new tractors. He is paying off his dangerous blood money to people who will bury you." I drove back to the estate under the cover of darkness, the rusted engine of the old Chevrolet humming a steady rhythm against the terrifying silence of the Texas night. Hank's trembling voice echoed relentlessly in my mind. Blood money. My son was not just stealing from the family empire. He was actively funneling our generational wealth to ruthless criminals. The absolute gravity of the situation settled heavy in my chest. If Lucas was dealing with that kind of darkness, direct confrontation would be a fatal mistake. He had already proven he was perfectly willing to use violent mercenaries to silence his opposition. If I confronted him now with what I knew, I would likely end up buried in a shallow grave out in the far pastures before the sun even had a chance to rise. I needed a completely different approach. I needed to become invisible. I needed to give them exactly what they were already trying so desperately to manufacture. They wanted a weak, confused, and rapidly deteriorating old man. I was going to give them a performance so completely convincing that they would voluntarily hand me all the evidence I needed to destroy them. The next morning, I began the charade. I found an old polished wooden walking cane that had belonged to my grandfather, tucked away in the back of my closet. I had never needed a cane in my life, always priding myself on my strong, steady gait, but today I leaned heavily onto the carved handle. I dragged my left foot slightly across the thick carpets as I made my way down the grand, sweeping staircase toward the main dining room. I let my shoulders droop, rounding my spine to appear smaller, more fragile, and completely defeated by the heavy burden of age. When I entered the bright, sunlit kitchen, Lucas and Victoria were already sitting at the long marble island drinking espresso and speaking in hushed, serious tones. The moment they heard my uneven, dragging footsteps, their conversation stopped abruptly. I did not look at them directly. Instead, I stopped in the middle of the room, letting my gaze drift aimlessly toward the blank, cream-colored wall near the pantry. I let the wooden cane slip from my grasp. It hit the tiled floor with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed through the quiet kitchen. I did not bend down to pick it up. I simply stood there, staring vacantly at the empty wall, my hands trembling slightly by my sides, letting my mouth hang open just a fraction of an inch. Lucas immediately jumped up from his tall leather stool and rushed over to me. He picked up the fallen wooden cane and gently placed it back into my hand, his eyes scanning my face with intense clinical scrutiny. He asked me if I was feeling all right and if I had slept poorly. I looked at him slowly, blinking my eyes several times, as if trying to clear a thick, confusing fog from my mind. I patted his arm weakly, and mumbled a disjointed sentence about the tractors needing fresh oil, deliberately referencing a maintenance schedule from over 20 years ago. Victoria sighed loudly from the kitchen island, clearly annoyed by the interruption to her morning routine. She walked over holding her delicate espresso cup and asked if I wanted the chef to prepare some oatmeal for my sensitive stomach. I turned to her, letting a warm, affectionate, but entirely vacant smile spread across my weathered face. I reached out and gently patted her manicured hand. I told her that sounded absolutely wonderful. Then I looked her directly in the eyes and called her Catherine. I thanked her for always taking such good care of me, speaking to her exactly as I used to speak to my late wife. Victoria stiffened instantly, a look of profound revulsion crossing her pristine features as she violently pulled her hand away from my grasp. She shot a furious, disgusted glare at Lucas, opening her mouth to correct me sharply. But Lucas quickly raised his hand, gesturing for her to remain completely silent. A dark, triumphant gleam suddenly ignited in his cold eyes. He realized what this apparent mental slip meant for their sinister timeline. He gently guided me into the adjacent living room and helped me settle deep into my worn leather armchair. He wrapped a thick wool blanket around my knees, telling me to just rest quietly by the warm fireplace. He then walked back toward the kitchen archway, leaving the heavy wooden doors partially open behind him. They believed my mind was rapidly slipping away into the dark abyss of dementia. They believed the deaf, senile old man sitting 30 feet away was entirely incapable of comprehending a single spoken word. Their guarded caution completely dissolved. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, staring blankly at the flickering orange flames of the gas fireplace, while listening intensely to every single syllable drifting through the open archway. Their voices dropped to an urgent conspiratorial whisper, but the acoustics of the grand hallway carried the sound perfectly to my ears. I heard Lucas pacing frantically across the marble floor. He told Victoria that the medical proxy was absolutely perfect now. He stated that the severe stress of the wedding preparations must have finally broken my fragile cognitive function. I heard the sharp click of Victoria's high heels as she followed him. She asked him if they were still on track for the strict Friday deadline. Lucas let out a harsh, breathless laugh. He confirmed that Friday was the absolute point of no return. He said the cartel intermediaries had already contacted him twice this week, demanding their scheduled payments. He told her the offshore shell accounts were completely drained, and if they did not secure my legal signature to liquidate the primary corporate reserves by Friday afternoon, the cartel would send their violent collectors directly to the estate. He promised her that once I signed the documents, the assigned doctor would instantly declare me legally incompetent, and the heavily armed transport van would take me permanently across the border. The conversation abruptly paused. I heard the sharp tapping of Victoria's designer heels moving purposefully across the marble floor, growing steadily louder as she approached the living room. I kept my eyes locked on the mesmerizing dance of the bright orange flames, maintaining the empty expression of a man whose mind had completely abandoned him. Victoria walked right up to my leather armchair and stood looming directly over me. The heavy scent of her floral perfume invaded my senses, masking the underlying stench of her betrayal. I did not flinch or acknowledge her presence in any way. She leaned down incredibly close to my face, her cold breath brushing against my weathered cheek. With a sharp, sudden motion, she snapped her manicured fingers aggressively right in front of my unblinking eyes. I did not blink. I did not react. A low, cruel, and genuinely delighted laugh escaped her throat. She turned her head slightly to look back over her shoulder at Lucas. "I is completely gone," she softly whispered. "Friday is going to be so easy." I waited in my bedroom until the digital clock on my nightstand shifted silently to 2 in the morning. The sprawling estate was completely quiet, wrapped in the thick, suffocating darkness of a rural Texas night. Lucas had recently spent hundreds of thousands of dollars upgrading the perimeter security. He installed state-of-the-art biometric scanners on every door, thermal cameras along the fences, and motion sensors in the corridors. He believed he had turned my home into an impenetrable fortress. He believed he had total control over who moved through these halls. But he lacked history. He lacked the fundamental knowledge of the very ground this mansion was built upon. He did not know about the hidden arteries running directly beneath his expensive Italian marble floors. Back in the early 1980s, before the massive corporate success, this area was notorious for sudden, devastating tornadoes that could wipe out a farmhouse in seconds. Catherine was terrified of the violent storms. To ease her, I had a team of trusted contractors dig a reinforced concrete storm cellar deep beneath the original foundation. As we expanded the main house into the massive estate, it was today I kept the original subterranean network intact. I had even expanded it, creating narrow maintenance tunnels that connected the old cellar directly to the ventilation shafts and the plumbing access panels hidden behind the walls of the newly constructed wings. I used them to fix busted pipes without tearing up Catherine's beautiful hardwood floors. Lucas was just a toddler when the heavy steel access doors were permanently covered by decorative wall paneling. He never knew they existed. I slipped out of my bed wearing completely dark clothing and soft rubber-soled shoes. I walked to the far corner of my massive walk-in closet. I pressed my hands against the heavy oak paneling, feeling for the familiar hidden wooden latch. With a firm push, the panel clicked and swung outward on silent, well-oiled hinges. A wave of cool, stale air drifted up from the pitch-black darkness below. I clicked on a small red-lensed tactical flashlight I had kept from my hunting days. I stepped carefully onto the concrete stairs, pulling the false wall shut behind me. The descent was very steep and narrow. The rough concrete walls felt damp to the touch, smelling strongly of old earth and undisturbed dust. I moved with incredibly slow, deliberate precision. I knew exactly where to step to avoid the hollow-sounding metal floor grates. In my deep jacket pocket, I carried two extremely small, highly sophisticated audio recording devices. They were military-grade microtransmitters, each no larger than a standard silver coin. I had acquired them years ago through a quiet favor from a close friend who ran private security contracting for overseas diplomats. They were designed to activate automatically upon detecting human voices, recording crystal-clear audio and storing it locally on a tiny encrypted memory chip. They emitted absolutely no wireless signals, making them completely invisible to the expensive electronic sweeping devices Lucas had recently installed around the corporate offices. I needed hard, undeniable proof of their conspiracy. I needed to hear their darkest secrets spoken in the absolute privacy of their own personal spaces. I navigated the dark tunnel system until I reached the access panel located directly behind the guest wing. This was the specific area Victoria had claimed as her personal lounge and dressing room. I carefully unscrewed the metal ventilation grate, pushing it aside with agonizing slowness. I crawled out of the dusty shaft and stepped silently onto the thick, plush white carpeting of her luxurious room. The air in here was incredibly thick with the suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume. I moved like a phantom ghost across the dark room toward her massive, brightly lit vanity mirror. The desk was covered in expensive cosmetics and scattered jewelry. I reached beneath the heavy wooden rim of the vanity table, feeling for a smooth, flat surface. I peeled the adhesive backing off the first micro recorder and pressed it firmly against the underside of the solid wood. Right. Exactly where she would sit every single morning to apply her makeup. I held it securely there for 10 full seconds, ensuring the industrial glue bonded permanently with the grain. The tiny device was now completely invisible, unless someone specifically crawled directly under the desk with a bright flashlight. I retraced my steps, slipping back into the ventilation shaft and replacing the metal grate without making a single sound. I descended back into the main concrete tunnel and walked 50 yards toward the sprawling east wing. This specific path led directly beneath the massive wood-paneled room Lucas had aggressively claimed as his private executive study. This was the absolute nerve center of his operations. This was where he made his private calls, locked his laptop, and planned my destruction. I reached the vertical access ladder and climbed slowly, my stiff joints aching with every painful upward movement. I pushed open the hidden floor panel located deep inside the dark, spacious coat closet of his study. I stepped out, leaving the panel slightly ajar for a quick escape. The study was vast and imposing. Heavy velvet curtains completely blocked out the glowing moonlight, leaving the room submerged in total darkness. I kept my red flashlight aimed strictly at the floor as I crossed the large Persian rug. I approached his massive custom-built oak desk. It was an intimidating piece of furniture easily weighing over 300 pounds. This was where he would sit to sign my life away. I knelt on the rug, grimacing as a twinge of pain shot through my knees. I slid my upper body completely underneath the heavy oak desk. It was cramped and dusty down here. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the second micro-recorder. I found a hollow groove carved deep into the thick wooden support beam near the back panel. It was the absolute perfect acoustic location. I peeled the protective backing off the recording device. I raised my hand in the cramped darkness, pressing the sticky surface of the bug firmly into the deep wooden groove. I pushed hard, counting silently in my head to make sure the adhesive locked onto the porous oak. Just as I reached the number 5, a sudden, terrifying sound shattered the absolute silence of the vast house. It was the distinct, heavy metallic clack of the study door unlocking. I froze completely. The polished brass door handle rattled loudly, turning downward with a sharp squeak. The heavy wooden door creaked open, swinging inward. A beam of bright yellow light violently pierced the darkness of the study, sweeping rapidly across the Persian rug, mere inches from my exposed boots. Heavy, purposeful footsteps stepped over the threshold, moving directly into the room. I was trapped flat on my back underneath the desk. I closed my eyes, tightly squeezing the tiny recorder into the wood. I held my breath in the pitch black, listening to the heavy boots walk slowly toward the desk. The heavy boots paused just inches from my face. I was trapped flat on my back beneath the massive oak desk, completely engulfed in the suffocating darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs with such violent force I was certain the intruder could hear the frantic rhythm. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed the tiny micro-recorder hard into the wooden groove, silently praying the adhesive would hold. The yellow beam of a flashlight swept across the Persian rug, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the stagnant air. A pair of polished leather shoes stepped directly into my line of sight. It was Lucas. He let out a heavy, exhausted sigh that sounded more like a growl of pure frustration. I watched, paralyzed, as he reached across the top of the desk. He grabbed a thick stack of papers, likely the very documents he intended to force upon me the next day, and aggressively shoved them into his leather briefcase. The metallic latches snapped shut with a sound like a gunshot in the silent room. He muttered a sharp curse under his breath, turned on his heel, and walked swiftly back toward the door. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, plunging the study back into absolute blackness. I did not move a single muscle for 10 agonizing minutes. When I finally dared to breathe, I slid out from under the desk, my joints screaming in protest. I retreated to the hidden floor panel, descended back into the cold concrete tunnels, and navigated my way safely to the hidden entrance in my bedroom closet. I collapsed onto my mattress as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the window blinds. I knew I had to act fast and get off the estate before Lucas could attempt to corner me again. I showered quickly, washing away the smell of damp earth and stale dust from the tunnels. I dressed in my usual worn denim and a clean flannel shirt, deliberately cultivating the image of a simple, harmless old man. When I walked down the sweeping staircase, I found Lucas sitting alone in the formal dining room, typing aggressively on his smartphone. He looked up, his eyes immediately darting toward my empty hands, clearly looking for the signed tax documents. I offered him a wide, innocent smile and tapped the side of my head as if scolding myself for my own forgetfulness. I told him I had completely fallen asleep reading the first few pages last night, and that my tired eyes just could not focus on the tiny print. Before he could unleash the flash of anger I saw brewing in his cold gaze, I quickly pivoted. I announced that I was taking the old farm truck and driving out to Austin for the day. I explained that an old mechanic buddy of mine had finally sourced some rare vintage carburetor parts for the classic 1970 tractor I had been restoring in the back shed. Lucas let out a slow, patronizing breath, clearly relieved that I was just going to go play with rusted metal instead of asking difficult questions. He told me to have a wonderful time and gently reminded me to sign the papers the moment I returned. I nodded obediently, turned my back on my treacherous son, and walked out the front door. The drive to Austin took just under 3 hours, but my mind was racing so fast, the journey felt like an eternity. I parked my rusted truck outside a small, unassuming antique clock repair shop, tucked away in a quiet industrial district. The faded wooden sign above the door read, "Carter Horology," but the dusty storefront was merely a peaceful retirement facade. The man inside was Benjamin Carter, a highly decorated retired federal forensic accountant, and my oldest, most trusted confidant outside of Hank. Benjamin and I had served together in the military decades ago, long before I built my agricultural empire, and long before he spent 30 years dismantling complex financial crime syndicates for the government. I pushed open the glass door, the small brass bell chiming sharply above my head. The shop was filled with the chaotic, rhythmic ticking of hundreds of antique clocks. Benjamin was hunched over a wooden workbench, a jeweler's loupe pressed to his right eye, delicately adjusting the microscopic gears of a gold pocket watch. When he looked up and saw my face, he immediately set down his tools. He knew me well enough to recognize the profound, silent terror masking my features. I locked the front door of the shop, flipped the open sign to closed, and walked over to his counter. My hands shook as I reached into my jacket pocket. I pulled out my digital camera and showed him the high-resolution photographs I had secretly taken of the supposed tax documents Lucas had given me. Then, in a low, trembling voice, I told him about the horrific beating Hank had endured, the sudden appearance of the armed mercenaries on my land, and the massive hemorrhages of operational funds being funneled directly into offshore shell companies. Benjamin Carter did not say a single word initially. His face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute professional focus. The warmth of the old friend vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating intelligence of a veteran investigator who recognized the distinct scent of a complex criminal conspiracy. He took the digital camera from my trembling hands, grabbed a secured, encrypted laptop from beneath his workbench, and told me to sit in the worn leather armchair in the corner. He carried the devices into a heavy reinforced steel door at the back of the shop, sliding a deadbolt shut behind him. He told me he needed to run the specific legal phrasing of the documents through his private databases and trace whatever financial breadcrumbs Hank had managed to uncover. I sat alone in the dim, dusty storefront for 2 agonizing hours. The relentless, synchronized ticking of the surrounding clocks sounded like 100 tiny hammers striking an anvil inside my skull. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, praying with every fiber of my being that I was simply a paranoid, confused old man who had profoundly misunderstood his own son. But the cold dread twisting in my stomach told me otherwise. Finally, the heavy steel door clicked open. Benjamin emerged from the back room. The change in his physical demeanor made my breath catch in my throat. All the color had completely drained from his weathered face. His skin was the color of old ash, and his eyes were wide with a profound, terrifying urgency. He walked slowly toward me, clutching a printed stack of papers so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He stopped just 2 feet away, looking at me with a mixture of deep sorrow and absolute panic. "Will," he said to me, his voice cracking with a chilling, desperate intensity as he looked down. "You need to call the police right now, my friend. These papers are not routine tax documents. They are your death warrant." The relentless ticking of the antique clocks felt deafening, like a countdown to my own execution. Benjamin pulled up a wooden stool, sat down heavily across from me, and let out a shuddering breath. He did not look like the confident federal investigator I had known for 40 years. He looked like a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. He dropped the printed photographs of the documents onto the wooden table between us. The fluorescent light above cast deep shadows across his weathered face. He reached out with trembling fingers, adjusting the pages so they faced my direction. I stared at the papers, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I asked him to break down what those pages were, keeping my voice as steady as I could. I needed the absolute, undeniable truth, no matter how it hurt. Benjamin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. He looked me in the eyes. He explained that the corporate lawyers Lucas had hired were masters of deception. They had deliberately buried the true nature of these documents beneath layers of dense, convoluted tax terminology. On the surface, the opening paragraphs read like a standard corporate restructuring proposal designed to navigate the tax laws. But as Benjamin had stripped away the deceptive jargon, the horrifying reality of the contract revealed itself. He slid the first photograph toward me, tapping his finger against a paragraph hidden on the fourth page. He told me that this was not a tax filing. It was an irrevocable power of attorney. If I placed my signature on that yellow line, I would be legally surrendering control over my life. The magnitude of his words hit me like a blow to the chest. I asked him to clarify what that meant for the company. Benjamin's expression hardened into a mask of grim certainty. He explained that the moment the ink dried on that page, Lucas would possess the legal authority to transfer, liquidate, or sell 100% of my core shares in Harrison Agricorp. He would not need my permission, my presence, or even my knowledge to drain the accounts dry. He could legally sign my name to any contract, authorize any offshore wire transfer, and hand over the entire corporate treasury to whoever he was secretly answering to. The $50 million deficit Hank had warned me about would be covered by my life savings. My son was not just trying to steal a portion of my wealth. He was systematically structuring a legal maneuver to strip me of every penny I had earned over the last 40 years. He wanted the farm, the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, and the holding companies. He wanted everything. I sank back into the worn leather armchair, feeling a numbness spreading through my veins. The financial betrayal was staggering, but I had built my empire from dirt and scrap metal. I could survive losing the money. I had started with nothing, and I was not afraid of being poor again. But as I looked at Benjamin's face, I realized the financial theft was not the reason his hands were trembling. The money was only the first half of the trap. Benjamin reached across the table and slid the second photograph toward me. The paper felt heavy and toxic in the quiet room. He told me that the financial theft was just the mechanism to clear his debts. But the second document was the true weapon. He explained that this was a durable medical proxy intertwined with a declaration of cognitive incompetence. I stared at the text, the complex medical terminology blurring together before my eyes. I asked him how a medical proxy could be a weapon. Benjamin explained the horrifying mechanics of the trap. The document was drafted to bypass the standard state-required waiting periods for psychiatric evaluations. It stated that due to my advanced age and a rapid onset of severe dementia, I was voluntarily surrendering my right to make my own medical decisions. If I signed that page, Lucas would be granted the authority to dictate my physical care. He would not need a court order. He would not need a judge's approval. All he would need was the signature of a single corrupt physician confirming my mental decline. And I already knew from the whispered conversations in my kitchen that Lucas had a private doctor waiting on standby to do exactly that. The room felt small, the air growing thin and inadequate for my lungs. Benjamin leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told me that the medical proxy did not just give Lucas the power to medicate me. It gave him the legal right to forcibly commit me to a psychiatric care facility without my consent. If I signed those papers, my son could have me restrained, sedated, and removed from my own home within minutes. I would have no legal recourse. No lawyer could save me because I would have signed away my right to ask for one. I would be a ghost, legally erased from society by my own flesh and blood. I closed my eyes, picturing Victoria's smile as she snapped her fingers in my face. She had known. She had known exactly what they were going to do to me. I opened my eyes and looked at Benjamin. I told him that I understood. I told him that my son wanted to lock me away in a local nursing home so he could steal my company in peace. I believed he simply wanted me safely out of the way to control all the finances. Benjamin shook his head, a look of profound horror shining in his eyes. He reached out and placed his index finger on the very last line of the final page. He told me I was not understanding the true depth of their cruelty. I explained that the lawyers had deliberately chosen a destination entirely beyond the reach of federal law. If I was taken there, my massive wealth would remain safely within the United States borders, under Lucas's absolute control, while my physical body was trapped in a foreign jurisdiction with no legal rights whatsoever. He read the fine print aloud, his voice shaking with righteous anger. The document did not list a luxury retirement community in Texas. It did not list a quiet, comfortable assisted living facility in the countryside. There were no state inspections, no patient rights advocates, and absolutely no way to contact the outside world. It was a concrete prison designed specifically for wealthy families who needed inconvenient relatives erased permanently without leaving a single trace behind. The transportation van was already booked. The border crossing was already arranged. The nightmare was planned down to the last detail. Benjamin looked up at me, his face pale as a sheet. He pointed directly to a specific clause near the bottom margin. "We'll look at the facility listed here," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "It is not in Texas. It is an unregulated black site psychiatric ward located down in Tijuana. If you sign this on Friday, you are never coming back." Those words hung in the dusty air of Benjamin Carter's shop like a heavy executioner's blade suspended right above my neck. "You are never coming back." I stared at the terrifying black site address printed in tiny deceptive ink at the bottom of the page. The sheer calculated malice required to send a father to an unregulated psychiatric prison in a foreign country was entirely beyond my comprehension. I felt a sudden violent wave of nausea wash over me. I stood up from the wooden stool, my knees shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the heavy workbench just to remain upright. Benjamin placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He urged me to stay and let him contact a federal prosecutor immediately, but I refused. I could not bring the authorities to my door just yet. If Lucas suspected even for a single second that I knew his true intentions, he would accelerate his deadly timeline. He would not wait for Friday. I gathered the printed photographs, thanked Benjamin for his undeniable loyalty, and walked back out into the blistering Austin heat. The drive back to the Harrison estate was an agonizing blur of highway markers and swirling dust. My blood ran completely cold despite the stifling temperature inside the rusted cab of the old farm truck. Every mile that brought me closer to my home felt like I was deliberately marching straight into a predator's den. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands cramped silently, repeating a single, desperate promise to myself. I was going to rip my empire out of their greedy hands. I parked the truck in the old barn just as the sun began to dip below the distant horizon, casting long, bleeding streaks of orange and purple across the Texas sky. I walked back into the main house through the side kitchen door, plastering that same vacant, senile smile back onto my weathered face. Lucas and Victoria were sitting in the formal dining room finalizing catering details for their lavish wedding. They barely glanced in my direction as I shuffled slowly past them, leaning heavily on my grandfather's wooden cane. I ate a meager plate of cold stew in my bedroom and locked the heavy oak door. Then the agonizing wait began. I sat in the darkness watching the slow, methodical sweep of the clock hands. I needed the house to fall into a state of absolute, undisturbed slumber. By 2 a.m, the sprawling mansion was dead silent. I slipped back into my dark clothing and soft rubber-soled shoes. I opened the hidden panel in my closet and descended into the cold concrete tunnels for the second time in 24 hours. My movements were practiced now, fueled by a sharp, burning adrenaline that completely masked the throbbing pain in my aging joints. I reached the ventilation shaft beneath Victoria's lounge first. I carefully removed the metal grate, crawled across her plush white carpet, and peeled the micro-recorder from the underside of her vanity mirror. I slipped back into the tunnel and made my way toward the east wing. Reaching Lucas's imposing study was far more terrifying this time. The memory of his polished leather shoes standing mere inches from my face the previous night made my chest tighten with a suffocating panic. I pushed the hidden floor panel open inside the coat closet, listening intensely for any sign of movement. The room was empty. I crawled underneath his massive oak desk, found the carved wooden groove, and pulled the second recording device free. I slid back into the floor panel, securing the latch tightly behind me. I did not return to my bedroom. I needed to listen to the captured audio immediately, but I could not risk doing it anywhere inside the house. Even with headphones, a sudden gasp or a sharp intake of breath could easily betray my presence. I navigated the subterranean tunnels all the way to the exterior exit hatch located near the old tractor sheds. I climbed out into the cool, damp night air and walked quickly toward my rusted Chevrolet. I did not turn the engine on. I simply put the truck into neutral and used my own body weight to push it silently down the slight incline of the gravel path, rolling it far away from the main estate structures. Once I was a safe distance away, I started the ignition and drove deep into the towering stalks of the north cornfields. The tall, dense crops completely swallowed the vehicle, hiding me entirely from view. I turned off the headlights and locked the doors. I sat in the absolute darkness of the cab, the only light coming from the faint green glowing indicator of the audio playback device I had connected to my phone. I plugged my wired earphones securely into the audio jack. I pressed the small play button on the illuminated screen. A soft electronic hiss filled my ears, quickly replaced by the ambient muffled sounds of the grand estate. I fast-forwarded through hours of meaningless background noise, the cleaning staff vacuuming the rugs, Lucas taking mundane business calls, and Victoria complaining loudly about the floral arrangements. I was looking for a specific pivotal moment. I checked the digital timestamp on the audio file and skipped directly to the exact evening of the engagement party. I needed to hear the unvarnished truth of what happened right after my muddy boots had supposedly ruined her imported rugs. I closed my eyes, letting the recorded audio transport me back to that deeply humiliating night. I heard the faint, distant rhythm of the soft jazz music playing in the foyer. Then I heard the sharp, aggressive click of Victoria's designer heels storming furiously across the hardwood floor of the East Wing corridor. She was marching directly toward the private executive study, and Lucas was following closely right behind her. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a violent, booming thud that made me flinch in the dark cabin of my truck. The jazz music was instantly cut off. The privacy of the study was absolute. The audio was crystal clear. The explosive, violent crack of an open palm slamming brutally against the solid wood of the massive oak desk vibrated right through my eardrums. I sat perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of my rusted pickup truck, the only illumination coming from the faint green glow of the audio device resting gently on my dusty dashboard. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I braced myself for the words that would inevitably follow the physical strike. I had desperately wanted to hear my son delivering a righteous, defensive tirade to his arrogant fiancée. I had deeply wanted to hear him demand absolute respect for his hard-working father. Instead, the voice that tore fiercely through the wired earphones belonged to a desperate, cornered wild animal. Lucas did not sound like the polished, incredibly charming corporate executive he pretended to be. His voice was laced with a raw, completely unhinged panic that made my blood run entirely cold. "Are you stupid, Victoria?" he roared, the sheer volume of his voice distorting the tiny microphone hidden carefully beneath his heavy desk. "Do you know who he is?" The iconic question from the engagement party was violently repeated, but this time it was entirely stripped of all its fake nobility and artificial respect. It was not a passionate defense of my honor. It was a terrifying reality check for his spoiled bride. He continued screaming, his breath ragged and heavy in the quiet room. I is the only signature standing between us and a $50 million debt to the cartel. I felt a sharp physical pain stab directly into the center of my chest. I closed my eyes tightly, listening to my only son unravel his own horrifying truth. He told her that he had completely burned through the company's liquid cash reserves, secretly gambling the operational funds away on volatile cryptocurrency investments that had completely crashed. The people he owed money to were not standard bank creditors or forgiving corporate lenders. They were violent, ruthless criminals who operated entirely outside the parameters of the law. They are threatening to skin me alive. Lucas hissed, his voice dropping into a desperate, trembling whisper that made my stomach churn with profound dread. If you piss the old man off before he legally signs the medical proxy, we are completely dead. Do you understand me? We are dead. The sheer gravity of his confession settled over me like a suffocating winter blanket. My son had not stepped in to protect me from Victoria's cruel humiliation in the grand foyer. He had stepped in to protect his one and only lifeline to personal survival. I was absolutely nothing more than a highly valuable pawn, a necessary signature required to clean up a $50 million mess he had foolishly created in the dark. The profound betrayal was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs, making it incredibly difficult to draw a steady breath in the sweltering heat of the hidden truck cabin. There was a brief, incredibly tense silence on the recording, followed immediately by the sharp, defiant click of Victoria shifting her weight on the hardwood floor. She did not sound intimidated by his sudden outburst. She sounded incredibly annoyed, her voice dripping with the exact same toxic superiority she had boldly displayed in the grand hallway. Then drug him faster, she retorted sharply, completely devoid of any basic human empathy or basic decency. I am sick and tired of looking at his disgusting muddy boots tracking dirt all over my beautiful house. I cannot stand breathing the same air as that pathetic old farmer for one more second. Get it done, Lucas? The sheer casualness with which she discussed poisoning a human being made my hands clench into tight, painful fists. But it was Lucas's immediate, chillingly calm response that truly shattered the final lingering pieces of my broken heart into a million irreparable fragments. Friday, he replied coldly, the desperate panic in his voice completely replaced by a dark, meticulously calculated resolve. We do it at the dinner on Friday night. I have already set the entire trap. You will cook his favorite meal. I will pour the wine. Once he signs those tax documents and the medical proxy is officially activated, the rest is incredibly simple. He explained his horrific plan with the methodical precision of a seasoned serial killer. He told her that his private physician, Dr. Evans, was already on strict standby for Friday evening. The moment my ink dried on the final page, the corrupt doctor would be quietly summoned to the estate to inject me with a massive, incapacitating dose of high-grade sedatives. I would be rendered entirely unconscious and legally incompetent before I even knew what was happening, and the transport van to Mexico is already fully paid for. Lucas finished, his tone completely devoid of any remaining affection for the man who literally gave him life. They will cross the border before midnight, and the facility down in Tijuana will keep him heavily medicated until he completely forgets his own name. He will just disappear, and we will finally have total control of the entire corporate treasury. The recording clicked softly as the conversation shifted to mundane logistical details about the wedding flowers, highlighting the absolute psychopathy of their casual transition. I reached up and pulled the earphones out of my ears with trembling fingers. The sudden silence inside the cabin of the old Chevrolet was deafening, pressing against my eardrums with an oppressive weight. I sat perfectly still in the dark truck, staring out through the dusty windshield at the towering, impenetrable stalks of the north cornfields swaying gently in the night breeze. A single tear rolled slowly down my weathered cheek, tracing the deep lines carved by decades of hard, honest labor under the unforgiving Texas sun. I thought about the countless hours I had spent building this massive agricultural empire, solely so my family would never have to experience the bitter sting of poverty. I thought about Catherine, and how utterly devastated she would be to witness the absolute monster our child had ultimately become. The agonizing betrayal burned deeply within my soul, a toxic fire consuming every last shred of paternal forgiveness I had left to offer. I realized then that my son was truly gone, completely consumed by an insatiable, blinding greed that had rotted his moral compass beyond any hope of salvation or redemption. He had made his horrific choice in the dark, and now he would have to face the devastating consequences in the light. I slowly wiped the tear from my weathered face, my hand steadying as the profound sorrow began to harden into something far more dangerous. The grieving, heartbroken father within me died quietly in that cold truck cabin, entirely replaced by the ruthless, calculating businessman who had built a massive empire from the unforgiving dirt. The son I raised, the little boy I patiently taught to ride a bicycle in the gravel driveway, the young man I proudly sent to the finest universities in the country, was actively planning to drug me, rob me of my entire life's work, and bury me alive in a Mexican asylum just to save his own skin. I pulled the earphones from my ears and let them drop onto the passenger seat. The silence inside the rusted cabin of the Chevrolet was absolute, broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of my own breathing. For a long, agonizing time, I just sat there staring at the cracked steering wheel, letting the horrifying reality wash over me. Then the tears finally came. I did not cry quietly. I broke down entirely, weeping with a profound, agonizing sorrow that tore at the very center of my chest. I wept for Catherine. I thought of how much she had loved that little boy, how she used to hold him gently in her arms and sing him to sleep when the violent Texas storms rolled in. I mourned for the son we had raised, the bright, eager child who used to ride with me on the tractors and ask endless, innocent questions about the soil. That boy was officially dead. The man wearing his face was a stranger, a hollow, ruthless monster who viewed my life as nothing more than a convenient transaction to pay off a cartel debt. The pain of that betrayal was a physical agony, a deep, burning wound that made me double over against the steering wheel. I let myself feel every single drop of that devastating grief. I grieved for my family, for the legacy I thought I was leaving behind, and for the illusion of a peaceful retirement that had just been violently ripped away from me. I cried until my lungs burned and my eyes ached, purging every last ounce of paternal weakness from my system. I knew that I could never look at my son the same way again, and I accepted that harsh reality with a heavy heart. When the tears finally stopped, a profound, eerie calm settled over me. The stifling heat of the truck cabin no longer bothered me. The crushing weight of sorrow evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, razor-sharp clarity that felt almost dangerous. I sat up straight and wiped my face with the back of my calloused hand. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The grieving, heartbroken father was gone, buried deep beneath the unforgiving Texas dirt. Staring back at me was the ruthless, calculating businessman who had spent 40 years crushing corporate rivals and building a massive agricultural empire from absolutely nothing. I had fought off devastating droughts, catastrophic floods, and cutthroat competitors to secure this land. I was not going to let a spoiled, arrogant child and his vicious bride steal it away from me. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception and ruin. They wanted to treat me like a helpless, senile pawn, but they had tragically miscalculated the strength of their opponent. I reached for my phone, my fingers completely steady now. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. It was time to hunt. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs, and prepared to dismantle the very life I had given him. I dialed Benjamin Carter first. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. I told him I had the audio evidence crystal clear and undeniably damning. I recounted the entire conversation regarding the $50 million cartel debt, the planned Friday dinner, the corrupt doctor, and the transport van waiting to smuggle me across the border. Benjamin did not waste time with sympathy. He shifted instantly into his federal investigator mindset. He told me to stay put while he made a few secure calls to his former colleagues in the Federal Financial Crimes Division. 30 minutes later, he called back with a comprehensive, airtight strategy. He had already contacted a federal prosecutor and a highly specialized team of federal marshals who had been quietly tracking the exact cartel syndicate Lucas was deeply indebted to. My son had unwittingly handed the federal government the perfect bait to dismantle a massive criminal operation. Next, Benjamin patched in a highly specialized corporate attorney he trusted implicitly. Working straight through the night from the cramped, dark cabin of my truck, I initiated a complex, aggressive financial countermeasure. By dawn, utilizing emergency corporate protocols and my overriding executive authority, I officially transferred my entire 90% controlling stake of Harrison AgriCorp into an ironclad, completely untouchable blind trust. The legal structure of the trust explicitly stated that any future signature I provided regarding corporate assets or medical proxy would be immediately rendered legally void unless countersigned by 3 independent federal judges. The trap Lucas was building for Friday was now entirely useless. The documents he wanted me to sign were essentially expensive scrap paper. I then called Hank. I told him to gather the old, loyal farmhands who had been quietly dismissed and have them wait at the county line. The real workforce was coming back to reclaim their land and secure the perimeter. We were going to hit them with a force they could never possibly anticipate. The next 2 days required a performance of absolute perfection. I returned to the estate and played the frail, deteriorating old man with flawless precision, allowing Lucas and Victoria to revel in their false sense of impending victory. I stumbled through the long hallways, asked the same mundane questions repeatedly, and feigned complete exhaustion. Every time I looked at their smiling, deceptive faces, a cold fire burned in my veins, but I kept my expression perfectly vacant. Finally, Friday evening arrived. The heavy, oppressive heat of the day gave way to a cool, tense twilight. I stood in my bedroom looking at my reflection in the full-length mirror. I did not put on a formal suit for their special signing dinner. Instead, I carefully buttoned up my best, most durable red flannel shirt. I reached into my closet and pulled out the very same pair of heavy, deeply scuffed leather boots that Victoria had found so profoundly disgusting. I left the dried mud perfectly intact on the soles, a stark reminder of the hard work that built this very house. I strapped my old brass buckle belt around my waist. I did not need a cane tonight. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, feeling the immense power of my own legacy coursing through my veins. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, signaling the beginning of the end. The hour had finally come. I walked out of my room and made my way down the grand staircase, the heavy thud of my muddy boots echoing loudly against the pristine marble floors. I turned the corner and walked directly into the grand dining room, where the lavish trap had been meticulously set. The final showdown had officially begun. I was walking into the lion's den, but they were about to discover that I was the one who owned the cage. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the formal dining room. The hinges silent from years of maintenance. The space was transformed into a theater of perfect deception. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow across the mahogany table set with our finest china. The savory aroma of hickory smoked brisket and roasted potatoes filled the air. It was my favorite meal, a recipe Catherine used to make on my birthdays. Victoria stood near the head of the table, wearing an elegant black dress, her face painted with an artificial warmth that made my stomach turn. Lucas stood beside her, decanting a bottle of expensive dark red vintage wine into a crystal pitcher. He looked like the loving son honoring his aging father. but my eyes quickly drifted past their staged bliss to the far shadowed corner of the room. Sitting stiffly on a velvet chair near the grandfather clock was Matthew Caldwell. The young corporate lawyer looked miserable. His skin was coated in a sickly sheen of nervous sweat, and he was clutching his leather briefcase tight against his chest like a shield. In his trembling right hand, he gripped the heavy gold-plated fountain pen, the very instrument they intended to use to seal my permanent doom. I stepped over the threshold, letting my muddy boots drag heavily against the floorboards. I slumped my shoulders forward, dropping my chin toward my chest, and leaned my weight onto my grandfather's wooden cane. Lucas set down the crystal pitcher and rushed to my side, playing the devoted caretaker with sickening perfection. He gently took my elbow, guiding me slowly toward the head of the table. He asked me how I was feeling, his voice dripping with honeyed concern. I offered him a weak, trembling smile and mumbled that my bones were feeling tired from the evening chill. Victoria pulled out my heavy wooden chair, her hands brushing against my shoulders with a feigned affection that felt like a crawling spider. She cheerfully announced that she had spent the entire afternoon preparing this specific meal just for me, claiming she wanted our family dinner to be peaceful before the chaotic wedding festivities began tomorrow. I sat down slowly, letting out a ragged sigh, and thanked her for her kindness. I picked up my silver fork and began to eat, chewing each bite with slow, deliberate movements. The brisket was dry and tasteless, but I forced myself to swallow. The tension in the grand dining room was a living, breathing entity. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock and the occasional clink of my fork against the china plate. Lucas poured a glass of the dark red wine and set it near my right hand, but he did not touch his own food. I was watching me with an intense, predatory hunger, his eyes tracking every single movement of my hands. He was waiting for the precise moment when my guard would be completely lowered. Across the room, Matthew Caldwell pulled a white handkerchief from his suit pocket and dabbed frantically at his forehead. He kept glancing nervously toward the large windows facing the long driveway. He was watching for the headlights of the transport van. I was waiting for Dr. Evans to arrive with the heavy sedatives. When I pushed my half-empty plate away, letting out a soft sigh, Lucas knew it was time. He smoothly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, stood up, and walked over to Matthew. He took the dark leather briefcase from the trembling lawyer, retrieved the thick stack of premium paper, and carried it back to the dining table. He laid the documents down directly next to my water glass. The bright yellow sticky notes marking the signature lines fluttered slightly in the breeze from the ceiling fan. He reached out and placed the heavy gold fountain pen right on top of the first page. He knelt down beside my chair, bringing himself to my eye level, and placed a warm hand over my calloused knuckles. His charming smile was absolutely flawless, completely masking the venom in his heart. He looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and spoke the exact words I had been waiting to hear. Just a quick signature, Dad, for the future of our family. I looked down at the heavy gold pen resting on the crisp white paper. I stared at the bold black letters spelling out irrevocable power of attorney and durable medical proxy. I slowly pulled my calloused hand away from Lucas's deceptive grasp and reached for the pen. My fingers wrapped tightly around the cool, smooth metal. It felt incredibly heavy, loaded with the massive weight of my entire 40-year legacy. I lifted the pen high into the air, holding it firmly between my thumb and index finger. Victoria let out a quiet, breathless sigh of pure relief, taking a small, eager step closer to the table. Lucas's eyes widened with greedy anticipation, his smile stretching wider across his handsome face. From the corner, Matthew let out a ragged breath, leaning forward in his velvet chair. They thought they had won. They truly believed the deaf, senile old farmer was about to permanently erase himself from the world. I did not lower the pen to the paper. Instead, I slowly turned my head and looked directly into Victoria's eager, calculating eyes. I saw the greed shining brightly within her gaze. I shifted my focus to the corner of the room, locking eyes with Matthew Caldwell, until the terrified lawyer visibly flinched and looked down at his shoes. And then finally, I turned my gaze back to my son. I stared into the depths of his soul. In that exact second, I dropped the entire performance. I straightened my spine against the back of the chair. The frail downward stoop in my shoulders vanished entirely. The weak, confused fog that had clouded my eyes for the past 48 hours cleared in an instant, replaced by a freezing, razor-sharp clarity that cut right through the tension in the room. I sat tall, projecting the unyielding, ruthless authority of the man who built Harrison AgriCorp from absolutely nothing. I looked right into his widening, terrified eyes, holding his gaze with absolute, unblinking intensity. "The future of the family?" I asked. My voice did not shake. It did not sound weak or frail. It dropped a full octave, ringing out through the silent dining room, completely steady and incredibly sharp. "Or the future of your $50 million cartel debt that you gambled away?" The reaction was instantaneous and violently physical. Lucas's charming smile vanished entirely, shattered into a million pieces right before my eyes. The color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin as pale as a fresh corpse. He stumbled backward, hitting the hard wooden edge of his tall chair, letting out a sharp, pathetic gasp of pure terror. I opened my fingers slowly. The heavy gold pen dropped from my grasp, clattering loudly against the solid mahogany table, the final sound echoing exactly like a stern judge's heavy gavel striking the wooden block. The gold pen lay perfectly still on the polished mahogany. Lucas stared at it, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He tried to speak, but only a wheeze escaped his throat. He looked at Victoria, then Matthew, frantically searching for a lie to explain away the massive secret I had dropped into the dining room. He finally found his voice devoid of its arrogant confidence. He stammered wildly, taking a shaky step toward me, raising his hands in a pleading gesture. He claimed he had no idea what I meant. He swore I was suffering from a cognitive hallucination, clinging to the narrative that my mind was broken. He told me stress was making me imagine things, and I needed to sign the proxy so Dr. Evans could help. I did not argue with his pathetic lies. I simply reached into the front pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out my smartphone. I had already linked it to the Bluetooth speaker hidden on the wooden credenza behind his chair. I did not break eye contact with my son as my thumb pressed the play button. The clear audio of his voice boomed through the dining room, echoing off the high ceilings and vibrating against the china plates. The recording captured the exact panic of his secret study conversation. "Are you stupid, Victoria? Do you know who he is? He is the only signature standing between us and a $50 million debt to the cartel." The sound of his recorded voice roaring those terrible words sent a physical shockwave through the room. I watched the blood drain from Victoria's flawless face. Her jaw dropped open in horror. She took a slow, trembling step backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the imported rug she loved so much. The audio continued, flawlessly projecting their darkest sins into the open air. "I burned the company's cash in crypto, and they are threatening to skin me alive. If you piss the old man off before he signs the medical proxy, we are dead." Then came Victoria's heartless response, demanding he drug me faster because she was sick of looking at my muddy boots. Finally, the recording delivered the ultimate devastating blow. Friday. We do it at the dinner. Once he signs, Dr. Evans is on standby to inject him with sedatives. The transport van to Mexico is already paid for. I tapped the screen, pausing the recording. The silence that rushed back into the dining room was toxic and dangerous. Victoria let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She threw her hands over her ears, as if she could physically block out the undeniable proof of her own malicious cruelty. She looked at Lucas with eyes wide with pure terror. She realized instantly that their elaborate trap had not just failed. It had been completely reversed, and they were the ones standing directly in the crosshairs. In the shadowed corner, Matthew Caldwell completely broke down. The slick corporate lawyer realized that being an accomplice to an embezzlement scheme and the planned kidnapping of an agricultural tycoon would end his life. He let out a loud sob of pure panic. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase onto the hardwood floor. The brass clasps popped open, spilling useless legal documents everywhere. He did not bother to pick them up. He turned his back on Lucas, abandoning his wealthy client without a second of hesitation, and sprinted frantically toward the grand entrance of the mansion. His polished shoes slipped wildly against the marble flooring as he ran for his freedom. He reached the heavy double oak doors leading out to the main driveway. He grabbed the brass handles, threw his body weight against the wood, and violently yanked the doors open. He expected to find the quiet, dark sanctuary of the Texas night. He expected to run to his sports car and drive far away from the catastrophic fallout of Harrison Agricorp. Instead, he was met with a blinding wall of flashing red and blue strobe lights. The circular driveway was completely surrounded. Dozens of armored federal sport utility vehicles had silently rolled onto the estate, blocking every possible exit. The brilliant red and blue lights pulsed aggressively through the open doors, casting long, frantic shadows across the marble foyer and directly into the dining room. Matthew stood frozen in the doorway, raising his hands to shield his eyes from the blinding glare. A broad-shouldered silhouette stepped out from the wall of flashing lights, walking purposefully toward the entrance. It was Benjamin Carter. My oldest friend looked sharp, projecting the uncompromising authority of a veteran federal investigator. He was flanked by a massive tactical team of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and United States Marshals, wearing dark tactical gear and protective vests. Benjamin did not slow down. He marched straight up the front steps, grabbed Matthew Caldwell by the lapels of his expensive suit, and effortlessly shoved the terrified lawyer back into the grand foyer. The tactical team swarmed into the mansion behind him, moving with absolute precision and overwhelming force. The quiet sanctuary of my home was instantly transformed into a chaotic, efficient federal raid. Agents poured into the hallways, their heavy boots stomping against the imported rugs. They moved directly into the formal dining room surrounding the massive mahogany table in a matter of seconds. "Get your hands where we can see them," a senior federal marshal ordered, his voice booming with undeniable command. "Move away from the table. Do it now." Lucas was paralyzed by shock. He stood frozen next to his chair, staring blindly at the armed federal agents surrounding him. Two agents did not wait for his compliance. They lunged forward, grabbing my son by his tailored shoulders. They violently spun him around, slamming him chest first against the nearest wall with a loud, forceful impact that shook the hanging picture frames. They aggressively pulled his arms behind his back, securing heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. Simultaneously, another group of agents tackled Matthew to the marble floor in the foyer, pressing his face firmly into the cold stone as they shackled him. The senior agent standing behind Lucas pulled out a small notepad. He began reading the Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, listing off the devastating federal charges one by one. He informed my son that he was being placed under arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, multi-million-dollar cartel embezzlement, and aggravated conspiracy to commit kidnapping across international borders. Victoria's shrieks pierced the dining room. She scrambled backward across the rug, distancing herself from the man she planned to marry. She pointed a trembling finger at Lucas, who was pinned against the wallpaper by federal agents. She sobbed, dramatically wailing she was innocent. She swore to Benjamin Carter she had no knowledge of cartel debts. She claimed Lucas was an abusive monster who forced her into complicity. It was a spectacular performance born of self-preservation, but no one bought her lie. I stepped forward, my boots thudding deliberately against the hardwood floor. I pulled out my smartphone and tapped the screen. The Bluetooth speaker roared to life, filling the room with the crisp audio of Victoria's own malicious voice. "I am sick and tired of looking at his disgusting muddy boots tracking dirt all over my beautiful house. Get it done, Lucas. Then drug him faster." The recording cut off sharply, leaving a devastating silence. Victoria's dramatic sobs caught instantly in her throat. Her false tears stopped flowing. She looked up at me in cornered panic, realizing her own recorded cruelty had permanently sealed her fate. The agents hauled Lucas away from the wall and spun him around. His tuxedo jacket was rumpled, his silk tie torn sideways. The heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists caught the glare of the flashing strobe lights pulsing through the front windows. My son looked nothing like the arrogant chief executive officer who had poured my wine earlier. He looked like a terrified child. His chest heaved with frantic gasps and cold sweat rolled down his pale face. The severe gravity of his federal charges had shattered his delusions of grandeur. He knew the cartel would discover his arrest within the hour. He knew that $50 million debt would follow him into the penitentiary. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor right in the center of the grand dining room. He looked up at me, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. He began to beg, his voice cracking with a hysterical desperation. "Dad, please," he sobbed wildly, thrashing against the firm grip of the federal marshals, attempting to pull him back to his feet. "You have to stop this. You have to tell them it is all a big misunderstanding. You are my father. I am your only son. You cannot let them take me away. The cartel will have me murdered before I even reach a prison cell. They will kill me, Dad. Please, I am begging you. Protect me. Use the trust fund. Pay them off. Save my life." His desperate cries filled the room, begging for the paternal protection he had so callously tried to exploit. A profound silence fell over the agents. Benjamin Carter stood near the doorway, watching to see how I would respond to my own flesh and blood, begging for his life. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for the sobbing creature kneeling on my floor. I slowly walked around the mahogany table, my mud-caked boots moving with deliberate purpose. I stopped when the toes of my boots were mere inches from Lucas's tear-stained face. I stared into his terrified eyes, seeing the exact same ruthless coward who planned to bury me alive in an unregulated Mexican psychiatric ward just to save his own skin. I kept my voice incredibly calm and completely steady. A good father would gladly lay down his own life to protect his son from harm. I said the words, cutting through his hysterical sobbing like a freezing razor blade. I would have given you every single penny I owned if you had simply had the courage to ask for my help like a man. But I absolutely refuse to be a human shield for a ruthless monster who smiled in my face while secretly planning to bury me alive in a concrete cell. You made your choice in the dark, Lucas. Now you will face the absolute consequences in the light. May God have mercy on your corrupted soul, because I have absolutely none left to give you. I turned my back on him without a second of hesitation. Lucas let out a devastating scream of pure agony and terror, thrashing violently as the federal agents hoisted him off his knees. They dragged him forcefully out of the grand dining room, pulling him through the marble foyer and out the heavy front doors. His desperate screams faded into the humid night air, abruptly silenced by the loud slam of an armored federal transport vehicle door closing shut. The nightmare of my son was officially over. He was gone, erased from my life by his own greed. Benjamin Carter stepped into the center of the room, motioning toward Victoria. She was still sitting on the floor, trembling violently, staring at the empty space where her wealthy fiancé had just been dragged away. She looked up at Benjamin, clutching her designer dress, waiting for her own federal handcuffs. Benjamin simply shook his head, looking down at her with absolute disgust. He informed her that while the audio proved her deep moral complicity, the federal wire fraud charges rested entirely on Lucas's digital signatures. She was not going to a federal prison tonight. However, Benjamin continued, his voice cold and uncompromising. She was officially trespassing on private property owned by the trust. He ordered her to vacate the estate immediately. Victoria scrambled to her feet, flushing with indignant rage. She demanded time to pack her expensive clothes and imported cosmetics. I stepped forward, cutting off her arrogant demands. I told her she was leaving my property right now exactly as she was. Every item in this house had been purchased with the corporate funds my son had stolen, which meant it all belonged to federal evidence. I pointed a steady finger directly toward the open front doors. I told her to get out of my sight before I pressed formal trespassing charges against her. Victoria glared at me with venom, but she knew she was completely defeated. She turned on her heel and marched fiercely toward the front entrance, her heels clicking angrily against the marble. As she reached the open doorway, a violent crack of thunder echoed across the valley. The Texas sky tore open, unleashing a torrential downpour. The heavy rain slammed against the gravel driveway, turning the dry earth into thick rivers of brown mud. Victoria stood at the threshold, looking in horror at the pouring rain. There were no luxury cars waiting for her. My oldest friend, Benjamin Carter, stepped up directly behind her, placing a firm hand squarely on her back. He pushed her firmly out into the violent storm. I watched with quiet satisfaction as Victoria Hastings, the arrogant woman who despised my muddy boots, was forced to march alone into the pouring rain. Her expensive heels sank deep into the thick mud with every agonizing step she took away from my home. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing out the storm forever. The house was finally quiet, perfectly clean, and entirely mine, once again free from their malicious, unforgivable greed. Exactly 1 full year has passed since that unforgettable stormy night. Today, the warm Texas sun shines brightly over the vast, rolling green fields of my estate. I am sitting quietly on the wide front porch in my favorite wooden rocking chair, drinking a hot cup of black coffee brewed with a dash of sweet cinnamon. The morning air is wonderfully peaceful. The heavy, suffocating tension that once poisoned this beautiful home has completely vanished forever. Harrison AgriCorp is currently thriving far more today than it ever has in its entire corporate history. I very happily stepped down from the exhausting daily operations and officially appointed Hank as the new Chief Executive Officer. He runs the entire company with the exact same uncompromising honesty and resilient grit that kept him loyally by my side for 30 long, hard years. He always treats the valuable land and our dedicated workers with the profound respect they truly deserve. As for Lucas, the federal justice system moved swiftly and without a single ounce of mercy. The overwhelming audio evidence and the massive paper trail of financial fraud permanently secured his fate. He was ultimately sentenced to 20 hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He still writes me desperate letters, sometimes begging for my forgiveness and crying for commissary money. I read his hollow words carefully. I processed the lingering sorrow deep in my chest, and then I silently shred the paper into tiny pieces. Some broken bridges once burned entirely to ashes by betrayal can never be safely rebuilt. I have dedicated this bright new chapter of my life to honoring the beautiful woman who truly mattered. I took the massive corporate profits that my son had viciously tried to steal and established the Katherine Harrison Foundation. We currently provide full comprehensive college scholarships for young, deeply underprivileged students who possess a genuine burning passion for American agriculture. I proudly watch these incredibly bright kids walk across the graduation stage, knowing Katherine would be immensely proud of the generous seeds we are planting for the future generations. I am no longer just a tired, defeated old man shuffling around the dark in muddy boots waiting for the bitter end. I am completely and undeniably free. My mind is razor sharp, my heart is finally light, and my soul is entirely at peace. I spend my quiet, happy days managing the charity fishing at the peaceful pond and enjoying the simple, honest fruits of my lifelong labor. Looking back on this devastating emotional journey, I learned that true wealth is absolutely never found in the massive bank accounts we build or the grand estates we construct. True wealth is found entirely in the unwavering character we cultivate and the loyal people who bravely stand by us in the dark. Greed is a blinding, horrific poison that can instantly turn your own flesh and blood into dangerous strangers willing to trade all basic morality for a fleeting taste of luxury. When someone finally shows you who they truly are, you must absolutely believe them the very first time, setting firm boundaries. Even if it means painfully cutting off those you once loved the most, is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate necessary act of personal self-respect. You must never let anyone, not even your own family, turn you into a helpless victim inside the very house you built. If this incredible story opened your eyes to the harsh, unspoken realities of family betrayal, please hit that like button right now to support this old farmer. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel today for more intense true life stories, just like this very one right here. Tell me down in the comments section below. Have you ever had to bravely cut ties with a deeply toxic family member to ultimately save yourself and your own sanity?